On this program, an excursion into wetlands, a visit underground, and a flight into the upper spheres of the Earth's atmosphere. Until very recently, people were only too happy to get rid of the marshes and swamps. Farmers would convert them into arable land. Speculators buy them up, dry them out, and sell them at premium prices. Yet the wetlands are far from useless. They, like all the other ecosystems, contribute to the biological balance of our planet. Swamps are considered a sort of no man's land. Impracticable, inhospitable, and unhealthy places. They have a neglected look about them, as if nature had forgotten to finish them. And yet these wetlands are complex ecosystems of unimagined beauty. In a swamp, a wooded wetland, water and soil combine to create a hybrid world. A watershed between the aquatic and land environments, swamps are the kingdom of amphibian life. Generally speaking, swamps appear in areas where there is poor water drainage. They are often formed from aging lakes that sediment has made shallow. A swamp can also develop when beavers harness a waterway by building a dam. This causes flooding in the area upstream of their dam. That flooded area, in the middle of which the beavers usually build their lodge, affords them excellent protection against predators as well as safe access to the forest where they find part of their food. Once completed, a beaver dam slows the current down considerably. As a result, the organic plant and animal matter suspended in the water settles on the bottom of the pond instead of flowing through. The land plants that have been totally immersed in the water begin to decay at the bottom of the pond. The decaying occurs in the almost total absence of oxygen. It releases methane and other gaseous compounds, which account for the characteristic odor of swamp areas. Finally, as the land plants die, aquatic plants emerge to colonize the pond. The pond gradually turns into swampland. The gradual buildup of sediments, rich in such nutrients as minerals, is a very favorable environment for plant growth. Moreover, the area is so saturated with water, there is no chance of a drought hampering that growth. In addition, because they are out in the open, marshes get a lot of sunlight. Thanks to all these factors, marsh plants can fix, by photosynthesis, maximum solar energy and convert it into living matter. Swamps and marshes are among the most productive ecosystems in the world. The productivity of an ecosystem is measured by the amount of living matter it generates in a given space during a specific period of time. The productivity of a temperate swamp, for instance, is comparable to that of a tropical forest, and about twice that of a temperate forest. For aquatic plants, there are a number of advantages to growing in water. Among them, the fact that water can support a good portion of their weight. They therefore need very few of the woody cells that give land plants their rigidity. The rich wetlands sustain a large and varied wildlife. They constitute an exceptional habitat for such amphibian animals as frogs, newts, and salamanders. They also provide shelter to countless aquatic animals, such as fish, crustaceans, insects, as well as many land animals such as elks and raccoons. Finally, there are a veritable haven for bird life, since the vegetative cover offers abundant food and good protection for nesting. Swamps have an important role to play in maintaining the balance between neighboring ecosystems. Capable of absorbing large quantities of water, somewhat like gigantic sponges, they regulate the water's ebb and flow. This has the effect of lessening water erosion in heavy downpours. They also act as filters, purifying the contaminated surface waters that flow through them. After decantation, the water that returns to the water table is pure. Unfortunately, all too often, the swamps have been the victims of industrial residential development and farming operations. As a result of these activities, swamps have been drained and their beds filled with earth, and this has reduced their size. Today, while the trend is now toward preserving wetlands, these areas face another threat: pollution. As they continuously filter polluted water, the swamps fill up with toxic substances, actually poisoning themselves. It would be ironic indeed if, because of human activity, precious wetlands were to become deserts. The soil is another ecosystem we are unfamiliar with. Besides earthworms and centipedes, most of us know very little about the millions of species that dig up, dig under, and dig through the earth. There is, of course, meaning behind all that hustle and bustle, at least in ecological terms. We walk upon the soil every day, without a thought to the world of living creatures that inhabit it. A Lilliputian world, with its own flora and fauna, predators and preys, herbivores and carnivores. It was long believed that soils formed a separate world, independent of life above the surface. Today we know that a third of the chemical energy stored in the living matter of a forest is returned to the soil. That manna would be lost to the forest inhabitants were it not for the underground flora and fauna who recycle it in what is known as biodegradation. Biodegradation occurs in the upper layer of the soil, called Horizon A. In this layer, organic waste is added to the vegetative soil litter. It is first broken down by the digestive processes of the small animals and insects inhabiting that layer, such as scarab beetles or cicada larvae. Microorganisms, notably bacteria and fungi, then break the carbon chains which compose this organic debris. They release from it the base elements, such as carbon dioxide, nitrogen, and sulfur. Through biodegradation, the minerals initially contained in the organic matter, such as nitrogen, become soluble in water. The rains carry them down to the next layer of soil, called Horizon B. This layer, also known as the leaching zone, is very high in nutrients. When in soluble form, the nutrients can be reabsorbed by the plant roots, and the cycle comes full circle. The third layer of soil is Horizon C, or parent rock. Its nature, in part, determines the soil's chemical composition and acidity. Through slow eroding, it also releases certain minerals, such as sulfur and iron, which further enrich Horizon B. Here, we are at the limit of the mineral kingdom, from which living things are excluded. Besides nutritive elements, life in the soil needs air, water, and space. These essential conditions are brought together by the porosity of the earth. The many interstices between individual soil particles allow for the air to circulate and water to be trapped before it drains down toward Horizon C. If most of the organisms living in the soil are restricted in their movements, the earthworm has no such problem. Indeed, the earthworm is very mobile. Constantly burrowing through the substrate, earthworms contribute to its porosity. Were it not for their constant channeling, the soil would quickly compact. Air circulation, as well as the soil's ability to retain moisture, depend on the never-ending activities of the earthworm. By establishing a firm root base, plants also change the texture of soil. The intertwining of roots makes the soil more cohesive and less friable. The soil therefore becomes much more resistant to erosion by water and wind. In addition, the vegetative cover effectively shields the surface of the soil from dryness or excessive sunlight. Today, we have a better understanding than we did in the past of the complexity of the terrestrial ecosystem and its interrelationships with life on the surface. When humans farm the land, they disrupt that biological balance and subject the soil to considerable stress, impacts they must constantly make up for. For instance, farmers use pesticides to combat the insects that ravage their crops. In the process, they also wipe out the organisms that trigger biodegradation in the soil. Stripped of these organisms, the soil soon suffers a lack of mineral salts, which is why it becomes necessary to use chemical fertilizers. Unfortunately, when drained away by rains, these chemicals pollute the water table. Also, the disappearance of earthworms and the use of heavy farm machinery cause the soil to compact. It then needs to be loosened, which is done by various techniques, such as tilling and harrowing. In turn, these methods, however, break the networks of roots and the structure of the soil, making it much more friable and hence more vulnerable to erosion. Such erosion may be caused by water drainage or by the winds that sweep across hectares and hectares of good arable land every year. Farmers would be well advised to be as concerned with soil conservation as they are with improving crop yield. By understanding the delicate balance between the underground world and the world above the surface, we may perhaps be able to better protect that most valuable of resources, the soil.
In recent years, we have at last started to show some concern about the air we breathe, but it's not enough. We must also concern ourselves with the planet's canopy, because whatever occurs in the atmosphere has a direct bearing on one of the basic components of life on Earth, the climate.
Besides supplying the air we breathe, the atmosphere is the stage of those climatic phenomena which greatly condition our lives. One of the vital roles the Earth's atmosphere plays could be compared to that of the glass windows of a greenhouse. Sunlight easily goes through the transparent panes of glass of a greenhouse. When the light reaches the ground, the energy absorbed heats its surface.
The heat produced is then radiated by the surface in the form of infrared radiation. But these rays do not travel back through the glass. Instead, the glass intercepts them and turns them back toward the ground, which heats up again, and so on and so forth. This phenomenon, called the greenhouse effect, is occurring worldwide. Indeed, certain gases in the atmosphere, such as water vapor and carbon dioxide, have the property of trapping part of the infrared radiation from the surface. 30% of the solar energy that enters the atmosphere never leaves it. As a result of the greenhouse effect, the average surface temperature of the planet is 15 degrees Celsius. Conversely, however, without the greenhouse effect, the heat radiated by the ground would return directly to space, and the average temperature of the planet would be a freezing -18 Celsius. The greenhouse effect is therefore essential to life. Various natural mechanisms regulate this global thermostat. For example, a natural balance exists between the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and the carbon immobilized by living organisms. Indeed, plants are veritable solid reserves of carbon. They absorb the carbon dioxide to fix it in their tissues. In return, animals graze on plants. They release the carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere through their breathing. The gas is then fixed by a new generation of plants. However, for more than a century, human activities, particularly our use of fossil fuels, have upset that balance. Oil and coal make up colossal reserves of carbon dioxide. Such reserves, trapped underground for hundreds of millions of years, are now suddenly being released into the atmosphere. As a result, since the beginning of the industrial era, global carbon dioxide levels have gone up 25%. Methane is another greenhouse gas whose levels in the atmosphere are also increasing. The culprit here is mainly the agro-food industry. Cud-chewing animals, such as cattle, for instance, produce half of the methane released into the atmosphere in their stomachs. And that gas, at equal weight, traps infrared radiation 58 times more efficiently than carbon dioxide. Chlorofluorocarbons, CFCs, are the latest of the greenhouse gases. These originally artificial gases were much used in the refrigeration and synthetic foam industries. For equal weight, CFC greenhouse gases are 4,000 times more powerful than carbon dioxide. If greenhouse gases are allowed to continue to increase, the climatologists predict that between now and the first decades of the 21st century, the excess energy trapped at the surface will cause a rise in the average temperature of at least 1.2 degrees Celsius. However, we have not yet managed to accurately determine how this global warming affects climates. For example, when it warms up, water contains more water vapor. Water vapor also contributed to the greenhouse effect. This phenomenon might then cause an even greater rise in temperature than estimated. Cloud behavior adds to the difficulty of making accurate projections. Cloud cover can have two opposite effects. Low, thick clouds screen out solar radiation and tend to lower surface temperature. By contrast, at high altitude, clouds are much thinner and tend to raise it. This is because they let the sunlight through but trap surface heat. and we do not know what type of cloud formation a rise in temperature might create. The ocean is another player whose role is poorly understood. Ocean waters contain large amounts of dissolved carbon dioxide. One consequence of a rise in temperature would be the release into the atmosphere of part of that gas, which would further contribute to the greenhouse effect. For the time being, there is not sufficient data to evaluate with any degree of accuracy what impact an intensified greenhouse effect might have. However, given the rate at which greenhouse gases are building up, we may well be playing with fire.
Did you know that temperatures only had to rise 4 degrees centigrade to bring the last ice age to an end and give us the conditions we know today? A similar rise in temperature could disrupt climate patterns just as dramatically and almost as unpredictably.